This is Radio 4.
There are some heights in Wessex, shaped as if by a kindly hand, for living, dreaming, dying on. And at moments when I stand, say on Ingpen Beacon eastwards, or Will's Neck westwardly, I seem where I was before my birth, and after death may be.
Hardy's Wessex. A journey through a partly real, partly dream country, presented by Desmond Hawkins, with Nigel Stock as Thomas Hardy.
Wessex. Familiar enough nowadays as a place on the map. There's a Wessex Tourist Board, a Wessex Water Authority, a whole lot of Wessex this and Wessex that. But where and what exactly is Wessex? It's not a county. It never was. You could say it's the West Country of England, but Cobbett's rural rides took him through the West, and he never mentions Wessex. The real Wessex originally was an ancient kingdom. It was a Saxon kingdom. Alfred the Great was a king of Wessex before there was an England for anybody to be king of. And when the kingdom of Wessex was eventually absorbed in the greater kingdom of England, that old Saxon name, Wessex, faded and died away in the pages of remote history. Until 1874. In that year, Wessex began its spectacular comeback with a passing reference in a novel. The title of the novel, Far from the Madding Crowd. And I'm standing now beside the statue of its author, Thomas Hardy, in the county town of Dorset, Dorchester. In a preface to a later edition of the novel, Hardy explained why he adopted this ancient forgotten word Wessex as his fictitious name for the setting of his stories.
The series of novels I projected, being mainly of the kind called local, they seem to require a territorial definition of some sort to lend unity to their scene. Finding that the area of a single county did not afford a canvas large enough for this purpose, and that there were objections to an invented name, I disinterred the old one. Since then, the appellation which I had thought to reserve to the horizons and landscapes of a partly real, partly dream country has become more and more popular as a practical provincial definition. And the dream country has, by degrees, solidified into a utilitarian region which people can go to, take a house in, and write to the papers from.
It was to explore this partly real, partly dream country of Wessex that I set off on a kind of pilgrimage, not just to see Eric Kennington's statue of Hardy, or to walk down from here to the County Museum to see Hardy's study and the collection of his books and papers, but to visit the landscapes he wrote about. Egdonn Heath, the Valley of the Great Dairies, Wessex Heights. I want to recapture something of his imaginative vision which makes these places live on so vividly. And I've no doubt of where I should begin, the cottage at Higher Bockhampton in the parish of Stinsford, where Hardy was born. It's only 2 or 3 miles from Dorchester, this cottage that was the home of the Hardy family for over 100 years. It looks very picturesque and well cared for today. Newly thatched, that's always a joy to see. And the garden so neat and colourful. As you walk up the lane, it's the last house you come to. Beyond it is simply the heath. Egdonn Heath, Hardy called it. In 1800, the cottage was the only building here, a very lonely place in a wild setting. When I was in Dorchester, I saw an old estate map on which somebody had written the words, "The New Street," on a track along the edge of the heath. And beside the new street, there was just one building plot with a name on it, J. Hardy. John Hardy. That's the author's great-grandfather. He was a stonemason and a bricklayer who rented this plot of land, and in 1800 he built a cottage on it for his son Thomas. I think I call him Thomas the First because 3 generations of Thomas Hardy lived here. As a young boy, Thomas the Third asked his grandmother what it was like to live here in those early days, and he put her answer into a poem, the earliest of his poems that has survived.
In days bygone, long gone, my father's mother, who is now blessed with the blessed, would take me out to walk. At such a time I once inquired of her how looked the spot when first she settled here. The answer I remember.
50 years have passed since then, my child, and change has marked the face of all things. Yonder garden plots and orchards were uncultivated slopes, all grown with bramble bushes, furze and thorn. That road a narrow path shut in by ferns, which almost trees obscured the passer-by. Our house stood quite alone, and those tall firs and bushes were not planted. Snakes and efts swarmed in the summer days, and nightly bats would fly about our bedrooms. Heath-croppers lived on the hills, and were our only friends. So wild it was when first we settled here.
Heath-croppers, incidentally, weren't people, they were wild ponies. As the Hardys prospered, the cottage was improved and expanded over the years. Today it belongs to the National Trust. You can visit it by appointment, which is what I'm doing now. Joel and me, the custodian's indoors expecting me, so I'll go in. Joe?
Oh, hello, Desmond.
Hello, good to see you.
Nice
Had
to
a
see
busy
you.
day, I expect, 'cause
Yes,
it's nice and sunny.
yes.
You've had some visitors?
Yes, quite a few today. The overseas ones usually start about April. They come from far and wide. Canada, Australia, America, Japan.
I've been calling you custodian, but there's something else I ought to say about you. It's a very happy coincidence, isn't it, that you are also a builder. I could even call you something like a country mason in the Hardy tradition. You could go back in your mind and see it as it was in earlier stages, when Hardy was here and the grandparents were here.
Yes, it was very much a working household here. Sometimes when we're sitting around, we, in our mind, drift back wondering how things were. And when we had to do some restoration work some while ago, we very carefully restored everything back exactly how they had done it. If you read Under the Greenwood Tree, you can imagine walking in that door and the whole thing is explained.
Yes, whereas now, of course, the door is a window.
Yes, well, as they progressed, they've altered things.
Yeah.
People also say in here about the dance, you see.
Yes, Under the Greenwood Tree.
How could they dance in this small room? But you see, in Hardy's youth, how he would have known it, that room there was in with this one. So it was one large room downstairs. For many years, we wondered where the previous staircase used to be. And about 3 years ago, we had to renew some floor joists over that part of the house. When we had the boards up, we found where the old trimmers were. The staircase hadn't been moved very far at all. The only thing is they turned it around the other way. He used to sit at the foot of that staircase there, and when the rays of the sun had gone down quite low and shining through the open door, it used to light up this room like a great furnace, I would imagine, because the walls were painted Venetian red.
In my childhood days, the staircase had its walls coloured Venetian red by my father, and was so situated that the evening sun shone into it, adding to its colour a great intensity for a quarter of an hour or more. I used to wait for this dramatic effect, and sitting alone there would recite to myself, "And now another day is gone," from Dr. Watts's hymns, with great fervency.
This was the parents' room here, Desmond. In fact, it was the room where Hardy was born. Mind your head when you come through there, Nathan. It's another quaint old doorway. This was the boys' room.
And so young Tom, as he would have been then,
Yes.
when he came home from working in Weymouth and wanted to go on with his writing his book, he would probably have settled down quietly up here, and Brother
Yes.
Henry would have been out doing
Yes.
something else.
And what a more delightful place that he could sit and overlook a nice garden and orchard beyond. This last winter we replanted about 10 new fruit trees. When we say new, they are new plants. The trusts are very keen to make sure that when they replant the orchard, they're doing it in 2 stages, that we get the old types of trees back in there. And we have researched mainly by reading what Hardy writes about under the greenwood tree. He describes some of the apples in there. For instance, the ones right down the very end, they didn't seem to know very well much about what they were called, but they were called the rail apples.
Because they were on the...
They were right at
fence
the end
road.
of the garden, down by the rails.
Yeah,
So they were referred to as the rail apples.
I mean, apples would, of course, have been very important to them in probably more ways than one. I mean, they could eat them as apples, but Father was a
Yes.
keen cider maker, wasn't he?
Yes, they made cider here.
In the autumn of 1873, I was writing Far from the Madding Crowd, and between whiles I assisted at my father's cider making, a proceeding I had always enjoyed from childhood, the apples being from huge old trees that have now long perished. It was the last time I ever took part in a work whose sweet smells and oozings in the crisp autumn air can never be forgotten by those who have had a hand in it.
They would be home for the cider making. Also, they used to keep a pig here, and that was also a high point of the year when it was pig killing time.
Yes. That was the way of life, of course, was to be as self-supporting as you could with a piece of ground if you had it, wasn't it?
That's right, yes. They had the orchard for probably some grazing for the horse. They kept at least one horse here. We even know what his name was. He's referred to as Bob in one of the letters.
Behind the cottage lies the heath, and I'm now following the path towards Rushy Pond and Rainbarrows and those other local landmarks that Hardy's made internationally famous in his portrayal of Egdonn Heath. In some ways it's still the wild place that his grandmother came to as a young bride. Walking here I can understand how this severe, unwelcoming landscape with its strange beauty and untamable character became one of the grand metaphors of Hardy's imagination, a symbol for him of nature's indifference to human frustration and despair.
As evening shaped, I found me on a moor, sight shunned to entertain. The black, lean land of featureless contour was like a tract of pain.
Gorse and heather and bracken are here, the outward signs that you'd expect of a poor, acid, sandy soil. But what might surprise you is the rhododendron. That doesn't quite fit the idea of an ancient wilderness untouched by man. After all, it's not much more than a couple of 100 years ago that the rhododendron was first imported into Britain. I don't suppose John Hutchins had ever seen one when he described the Dorset heathland as it was in 1773 in his celebrated history of the county.
Near Piddletown begins a large tract of heathy ground, which from thence eastwards occupies a great part of the southern coast and extends to Hampshire and Surrey. This is professedly the most barren part of the county, and nature, who has in other parts distributed her beauties with so liberal a hand, seems here, by way of contrast, to exhibit a view of all others the most dreary and unpleasing.
Beauty is indeed, in the eye of the beholder, the most dreary and unpleasing in the eyes of John Hutchins, but Hardy saw it differently.
Haggard Egdon appealed to a subtler and scarcer instinct, to a more recently learnt emotion than that which responds to the sort of beauty called charming and fair. The time seems near, if it has not actually arrived, when the chastened sublimity of a moor, a sea, or mountain will be all of nature that is absolutely in keeping with the moods of the more thinking among mankind.
In landscapes as in other things, tastes do indeed change. Hutchins looked at the Dorset heaths in the typical 18th century way, as a blot on the landscape. Hardy took his cue from Wordsworth and the Romantic movement. And if our taste today puts a value on wild, untamed country, on wilderness as we'd say, then it owes something to Hardy, and particularly to the way he presented Egdonn Heath in The Return of the Native.
Twilight combined with the scenery of Egdonn Heath to evolve a thing majestic without severity, impressive without showiness, emphatic in its admonitions, grand in its simplicity. The place became full of a watchful intentness now, for when other things sank brooding to sleep, the heath appeared slowly to awake and listen. Every night its titanic form seemed to await something. But it had waited thus unmoved during so many centuries, through the crisis of so many things, that it could only be imagined to await one last crisis, the final overthrow. The great inviolate place had an ancient permanence which the sea cannot claim. Who can say of a particular sea that it is old, distilled by the sun, kneaded by the moon? It is renewed in a year, in a day, or in an hour. The sea changed, the fields changed, the rivers, the villages, and the people changed, yet Egdonn remained. Those surfaces were neither so steep as to be destructible by weather, nor so flat as to be the victims of floods and deposits. With the exception of an aged highway and a still more aged barrow, themselves almost crystallized to natural products by long continuance. Even the trifling irregularities were not caused by pickaxe, plough, or spade, but remained as the very finger touches of the last geological change.
Inviolate is hardly a word you'd apply to Egdonn now. The finger touches of the 20th century include the Army's tank training camp at Bovington and the atomic energy establishment at Winfrith. I've now walked up to Rushy Pond, a favourite spot for Thomas Hardy on what he would have known as the open heathland of Puddletown Heath. He was standing here one day looking through his father's telescope at Dorchester Jail when he saw a man being publicly hanged there.
The sun behind my back shone straight on the white stone facade of the jail, the gallows upon it, and the form of the murderer in white fustian. The executioners and officials in dark clothing, and the crowd below, being invisible at this distance of nearly 3 miles. At the moment of my placing the telescope to my eye, the white figure dropped downwards, and the faint note of the town clock struck 8. The whole thing had been so sudden that the telescope nearly fell from my hands. I seemed alone on the heath with the hanged man.
Times change. They don't have public hangings in Dorchester nowadays, and most of Puddletown Heath is a plantation of conifers belonging to the Forestry Commission. I suppose one of the biggest changes in the character of the many heaths that come together in Hardy's collective name of Egdonn is the softwood plantations that have replaced the open landscape of heather and gorse. The Forestry Commission's chief forester for much of Wessex, and that includes Egdonn Heath, is Alan Dunning.
Puddletown itself, in fact, does contain a high proportion of hardwoods. This particular area, if we go across just a wee bit down the road, we will see plantations of beech, pure beech crops, beech in mixture with conifers, and the ultimate long-term management plan for those areas, obviously, is as a beech forest. And The areas of conifer that we see here on Puddletown are restricted to the Bagshot Heaths, the sands, gravels. And our plans are to remove all of the conifers adjacent to the cottage back to a point that looks right, to maintain all of the birch and all the hardwood species actually, and what old Scots pine are there, because these would have been the native trees of the heath.
Yes, yes.
And I have put plans forward to the National Trust that rather than allow it really to go back to an unmanaged heathland environment, I am constantly concerned of the fire risk that this would cause, and they are quite prepared to go quite a long way in actual landscaping this particular area. And I think it will enhance both Thomas Hardy's cottage, and I think it will also enhance the Forestry Commission forest.
Puddletown's one of several villages and hamlets which take their name from the river Puddle or Piddle that flows down from the Chalk Downs through Egdonn Heath. There's a Toll Puddle and Aff Puddle and other ones. And next to them, on the edge of the heath, is Beer Regis on a little tributary of the Piddle. It's called the Beer Stream, simply. And Beer Regis corresponds to the place that Hardy called Kingsbere. So it's not a great piece of detective work, really, to see the connection. Beer Regis or Kingsbere, that's certainly a place to visit, and that's where I'm going next. What draws me to Beer Regis, and I come here often, is its church. I think it's one of the treasures of Wessex, and it starts to surprise you even before you get inside. Over the south door, there are two great iron hooks. They look at first as if they must have something to do with agriculture, but I believe the purpose of them was for pulling off burning thatch in the days when every cottage in the village would have been thatched. And when they had a fire, they'd get these great hooks and get them up in among the thatch, and they'd pull the burning material down. That was the only way they could deal with a fire. Well, what I was the famous roof, which is what brings so many people to this church, but there's a thing that always amuses me a great deal. First of all, as you come in, there are these three marvellous Norman columns, and the men who built them had a nice sense of humour because they put little amusing sculptures, just tucked them in little places where they could find a niche to put them. There's one of a man holding his head. He's obviously got a dreadful headache. And then there's another one of a man pulling his mouth open and he's got toothache. And then as you come into the nave and you look up, you really do get a surprise, because this is one of the sights of England, I think. It's a tremendous roof built of wood, and it has figures of the apostles, carved life-size figures, but of course figures of the time. This would be perhaps 15th century figures, but in the role of the apostles. It's a splendid and magnificent sight, and it was built by Cardinal Morton. He was a local boy made good, and he remembered kindly the church and the district of his boyhood, and he had this marvellous roof put in. To one side, in the earlier days, the nuns of Tarrant Crawford would have sat, and then from the 14th century onwards, sharing the church with them would have been the Turberville family. This is the name, of course, which Hardy adapted for his novel Tess of the D'Urbervilles. He knew this church well, and he wanted the idea of an ancient and grand family that had come down in the world. And so he took the Turbervilles and made Beer Regis, or Kingsbere as he called it, he made that the family church that Tess's mother and father eventually heard about. But their glory shows most of all in the Turberville window, and I'm looking up at it now, and a great sight it is. And this is really a pedigree without words, because if you understand heraldry, you could look at it and you could see the quarterings which show the different marriages that Turberville's made. Their arms will be quartered with the families they married into. And it's a kind of little history of a part of England told in pictures. A splendid sight, beautifully coloured. It gives a rich impression of what these great medieval families must have been like in their pride.
Under the church of that there parish lie my ancestors, hundreds of them, in coats of mail and jewels, in girt lead coffins weighing tons and tons. There's not a man in the county of South Wessex that's got grander and nobler skeletons in his family than I.
We've been found to be the greatest gentlefolk in the whole county, reaching all back long before Oliver Cromwell's time, to the days of the pagan Turks, with monuments and vaults and crests and scutcheons, and the Lord knows what all. In St. Charles's days, we was made Knights of the Royal Oak, our real name being d'Urberville. Don't that make your bosom prim? 'Tis thoughted that great things may come o't. No doubt the members of folk of our own rank will be down here in their carriages as soon as 'tis known.
For Tess herself, this church at Kingsbere, with its d'Urberville associations, was to be a place of unhappy memories. For her, life had been at its brightest a few miles away to the southwest in the valley of the Great Dairies. That was Hardy's name for the valley of the River Frome between Dorchester and Wareham, or to use his fictitious names, between Casterbridge and Anglebury. The point I've chosen in Fromeside Vale is the weir that Hardy called Shadwater Weir in The Return of the Native. In that novel, the emphasis is always on the austere and sombre heath which broods darkly on either side of the river. The waters of the Frome running through Egdonn Heath then represent only death by drowning. It's in this weir that the two fugitive lovers, Eustacia and Damon, were drowned, and there's really no better example of the way Hardy transformed reality to match his imagination. In the same landscape he can find such opposite moods. The river isn't even given a name in The Return of the Native, and its valley is made much narrower than it really is, and it's disregarded. Egdonn Heath is all that matters. But in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, the heath is pushed into the background, and this same river spreads fertility and the renewal of life. As Tess sees it in the valley of the Great Dairies, it's the very antithesis of Egdonn. It's lush and it's fertile. It oozes with the prosperous bounty of nature. And that's as I see it now, a broad level plain extending from Dorchester down to Wool and to Wareham, rich alluvial pastures devoted to dairy farming, cows everywhere I look, and the river itself, just as Hardy described it in his words, clear as the pure river of life shown to the evangelist, rapid as the shadow of a cloud, with pebbly shallows that prattle to the sky all day long. The whole scene is fresh, encouraging, full of hope. Here, on a time-scented bird-hatching morning in May, Tess came to start a new life as a dairymaid after the death of her baby.
Tess d'Urberville then, in good heart and full of zest for life, descended the Egdon slopes lower and lower towards the dairy of her pilgrimage. The irresistible, universal, automatic tendency to find sweet pleasure somewhere, which pervades all life from the meanest to the highest, had at length mastered her. And thus her spirits and her thankfulness and her hopes rose higher and higher.
She tried several ballets, but found them inadequate, till, recollecting the psalter that her eyes had so often wandered over of a Sunday morning, before she had eaten of the tree of knowledge, she chanted, "O ye sun and moon, O ye stars, ye green things upon the earth, ye fowls of the air, beasts and cattle, children of men, Bless ye the Lord, praise him and magnify him forever. She suddenly stopped and murmured, but perhaps I don't quite know the Lord as yet.
In every detail of the scene, Hardy celebrates the fecundity of the landscape. Old Egdonn may still lurk in the background, a symbol perhaps of later tragedies that threaten Tess, but for the time being it's irrelevant to the singing vitality, the sheer joy of the green pastures and the flourishing dairy herds that so impressed the young girl at her first sight of them.
The cows that would stand still of their own will were milked in the middle of the yard, where many of such better behaved ones stood waiting now, all prime milchers, nourished by the succulent feed which the water meads supplied at this prime season of the year. Their large-veined udders hung ponderous as sandbags, the teats sticking out like the legs of a gypsy's crock, and as each animal lingered for her turn to arrive, the milk oozed forth and fell in drops to the ground.
This feeling of spring busting out all over pervades every aspect of the valley. It's what Hardy calls the leafy time, when arborescence seems to be the one thing aimed at out of doors. Everything is subordinated to the one great purpose. Plant and animal, man and woman, all respond to the thrust and the drive of new life.
Rays from the sunrise drew forth the buds and stretched them into long stalks, lifted up sap in noiseless streams, opened petals, and sucked out scents in invisible jets and breathings.
Amid the oozing fatness and warm ferments of the Frome Vale, at a season when the rush of juices could almost be heard below the hiss of fertilization, it was impossible that the most fanciful love should not go passionate. The ready bosoms existing there were impregnated by their surroundings.
By the autumn, Tess is pledged to Angel Clare and is living, so Hardy tells us, in spiritual altitudes more nearly approaching ecstasy than any other period of her life. At this season, the presence of the river is more strongly felt. The sounds of stream and brook become more noticeable.
The water was now high in the stream, squirting through the weirs and tinkling under culverts. The smallest gullies were all full. During this October month, Tess and Angel roved along the meads by creeping paths which followed the brinks of trickling tributary brooks, hopping across by little wooden bridges to the other side and back again. They were never out of the sound of some purling weir, whose buzz accompanied their own murmuring, while the beams of the sun, almost as horizontal as the mead itself, formed a pollen of radiance over the landscape.
And so it continues, an idyllic landscape, the Fromeside Vale, the valley of the great dairies, perhaps the most lyrical of Hardy's celebrations of any of the Wessex landscapes.
The flowery river ooze upheaves and falls. The milk purrs in the pail. Few pilgrims but would choose the peace of such a life, in such a vale.
Well, you won't hear milk purring into the pail nowadays, and the cows are beasts of a different colour from the ones that Tess milked. What else has changed, and what still endures in the valley of the great dairies and on the heath along its flanks? I asked Michael Chandler, who farms at Hurst between Woodsford and Morton.
A lot of the meadows were watered, as you say, and now that's almost a thing of the past. Just one or two people still just cling to it, but basically we're not using that method now. It's too much work. Most of us use the lower lands near the river for cattle. The water table's higher there, so that it grows better grass than certainly this land up on the drier section of the farm. Has its problems because the water rises. With the weed now in the river very high, as you saw, we can get bogged out by the rising waters even this time of year.
The other big change, I suppose, will be in people, in the sense that, with their big herds, they had big numbers to do the hand milking.
That's right. Well, here my herd's about 120, and Dennis milks and does most of the management for that all through the year. Whereas I suppose in Hardy's time, what we're doing, 12 cows per person was about the sort of target, I think. I started on a little farm and learned hand milking, and you always kept an eye out to try and land up on an easy one or a quiet one, so you didn't get the bucket kicked away, especially as a youngster. You didn't want to lose out on that. Dennis assembles them in the covered yard, collecting yard, fairly tight, squeezed together, and then opens the parlour doors, the parlour being the building where we milk the cattle, and he stands in the middle, and the cows come along in, 6 each side. It's a herringbone parlour. They present their backsides to him in sort of herringbone fashion, as you saw. And with the milking machine pump running, the clusters are attached to the cows, and the vacuum draws the milk off, takes it away in glass and stainless steel pipes, filters it, and cools it, leaves it there ready for collection. And he's using 12 units. It takes him an hour and a half to milk 120 cows, something of that order, this time of year.
From Hurst, I followed the river past Woolbridge Manor House, the scene of Tess's brief and disastrous honeymoon, down to Wareham. Anglebury was Hardy's own name for Wareham, and it's a place to pause at because of its strategic position. It stands between the two rivers, the Frome and the Piddle, and they meet as they enter Poole Harbour in the Wareham Channel. And Wareham straddles the causeway that leads over the moors and the heath to the Isle of Purbeck, so it's a commanding situation, and it makes the town a good centre for exploring some of the different faces of Dorset. Poole Harbour is the largest natural harbour in Europe. Indeed, in the world, it's surpassed only by Sydney in Australia. East of Wareham, the Arn Peninsula is a stronghold of one of Britain's rarest birds, the Dartford warbler, and that's protected here by the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. Then to the south, there's a stretch of Egdonn Heath still surviving in much the condition that Hardy knew and described. And so it's to the south I've come, from Wareham to Sleep Farm, which is now the local headquarters of the Nature Conservancy Council. And it's a marvellous position for it to be, because it's right in the middle of what I regard really as probably the best bit of Egdonn Heath that you can find nowadays. Exactly really as you would imagine it if you've been reading Return of the Native. The browns, the fawns, the duns, the sad melancholy colours of the basic heathland, and then the little splashes of golden gorse that give it a sudden pitch up where your eye catches it. And in other places on the heath there are the boggy bits, and they're also so characteristic of Egdonn Heath. And as your eye goes beyond that, suddenly the most dramatic thing happens. You find you're caught in the great wall of the Purbeck Hills. They stretch the whole length of the horizon beyond the heath, and there's just the one cleft, that one nick in the middle, and in that cleft there's Corfe Castle, rising up as the custodian that guards the whole of Purbeck and separates it. Perhaps that's why they call it the Isle of Purbeck. Jim White's the Assistant Regional Officer of Nature Conservancy Council here at Sleep Farm. Jim, as a naturalist, how would you describe the heath?
The heaths in Dorset, because they occupy this position in the centre of the south coast on such extremely acidic soils, are really the home of a number of very localised and often nationally rare plants and animals, insects, and we reckon they're probably amongst the best examples left anywhere in Europe.
Two of the things that I would care about a lot are the Dartford warbler and the marsh gentian. They're two of the things that to me summon up in a way the atmosphere of the heath. How do they do?
Well, the Dartford warbler, unlike most warblers, it spends the winter here, so it depends on a fairly mild climate.
that, of course, is one of the reasons it suffers from time to time. When we have a spate of bad winters, we had 2 in a row a couple of years ago, of course, and that really knocked the population down. Fairly severe fires on the unprotected bits of heathland, which, even if they don't actually harm or damage the individual birds, of course, spoil the nesting habitat for a good few years. They're not easy birds to see, you know that well enough, but one can be quite fortunate and see and hear the birds on these heathlands.
And Marsh Gentian, that was some nice boggy ground, of course.
That's right, rather different habitat, of course. One of the things that marsh gentian would suffer from, I think, is if a piece of heathland became very closed and densely vegetated by particularly, say, purple moorgrass and heather, the gentian, I think, would tend to gradually decline. So the occasional fire on a piece of wet heathland probably does the marsh gentian a bit of good, actually, because it opens the thing up again and you tend to get a flush of flowering afterwards. But there are quite a few sites, let's say 20 or so probably heathland sites in this part of Dorset which still support reasonable populations of marsh gentian, and there's certainly more on the Dorset heathlands than anywhere else in the rest of the country put together, so it's a very important place for marsh gentian as well as Dartford warbler.
At Corfe you enter another world. The soft boggy patches, the sandy heaths of Egdonn, they're behind you now. Purbeck is rock hard, lofty, continuously engaged in an age-old struggle with wind and with wave. Quarrymen and seafarers are its traditional figures. Stone and sea water are its elements. Hardy knew Purbeck well. In the first year of his marriage to Emma Gifford, they lived for a time at Swanage. The cliffs and the headlands of Purbeck and the tempestuous wintry seas that beat against them had a powerful effect on Hardy. With Emma he walked daily on the cliffs and along the shore, and in a note made at the time, he described an evening when they sat together just after sunset on a stone under a wall, listening to the background roar of the sea and the song of a bird nearby.
The sounds are 2, and only 2. On the left, Durlston Head roaring high and low like a giant asleep. On the right, a thrush. Above the bird hangs the new moon and a steady planet.
They had been married less than a year. The notebook entry suggests a closely shared and deeply felt mood, which found a more permanent expression in the poem entitled Once at Swanage.
The spray sprang up across the cusps of the moon, and all its light loomed green as a witch flame's weirdsome sheen at the minute of an incantation scene, and it greened our gaze that night at demi-noon. Roaring high and roaring low was the sea beyond the headland shores. It symboled the slamming of doors, or a regiment hurrying over hollow floors. And there we two stopped, hands clasped, I and she.
Hardy's Wessex was written and presented by Desmond Hawkins, with Nigel Stock as Thomas Hardy. The readers were Pauline Wynne and Douglas Leach, and the programme was produced in Bristol by John Knight.